How is it that some millionaires go broke, and what can we learn from their mistakes? How can you easily tell if you're on track to retire? And why is early retirement a terrible goal? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 31st episode of the DoughRoller Podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller Podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Welcome to day 24 of the 31-day money challenge. I've got a ton of things to get to today. This is actually going to be probably the longest podcast I've recorded when it's all said and done. I've got a number of news items, reader comments, and reader questions that I want to go through. So that'll be the first thing we do. Then I want to talk about an easy way to tell if you're on track to retire. I think it's not perfect, but it's a very easy way to get a rough gauge of where you are on saving for retirement. You know, people talk about the number. If you have a number that you want to hit, or a certain percent of your income that you should be able to replace in retirement, and all of those things are fine. But then the question becomes, okay, that's all fine and well, but I'm 40. I've got X in the bank. This is how much I make. Am I close? Am I on track? That's really, I think, the question that a lot of people want answered. And I think some real careful analysis is important, but I think there's an easy way to kind of get a rough measure of where you stand, and we're going to talk about that today. So I want to get to it. First, I want to give a big thank you to our two sponsors, Betterment, an online platform that helps you invest your money in both stocks and bonds. You just pick the percentage you want in each, and Betterment does the rest. It rebalances and reinvests your dividends automatically. You can check them out at betterment.com. And Personal Capital, a free online tool. It aggregates all of your investments, taxable and retirement, brings them all into one place, shows you your performance, shows you your asset allocation, shows you the fees that you're paying, has a 401k analyzer that not only shows you the fees that you're paying in your 401k, but the effect of those fees over a lifetime of investing. In fact, I was just looking at that for me earlier today, and it's a real eye-opener. So you can check that tool out at personalcapital.com. Okay, so first I want to go to some news items. Vince Young filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. You may be asking two questions right now. One, who is Vince Young? And two, what exactly is Chapter 11 bankruptcy? Well, if you're a football fan, you know who Vince Young is. He won a national championship. Well, he and his team won a national championship. I want to say it was 2005, but someone will definitely correct me if I'm wrong. He was at Texas. I think it was 2005. And then he went number 3 overall, as I recall, in the 2006, I'm pretty sure, 2006 draft. He was originally drafted by the Tennessee Titans. At the moment, he's not playing football. He bounced around after a while, and then he got cut by a couple of teams. And he just filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which is reorganization. It's where you try to work out a plan with all of your debtors, all of the folks that you owe money to. But here's the thing that's so stunning about this. When he entered the NFL, he had a contract, a rookie contract that he signed, worth $25.7 million guaranteed. That was in 2006. And now, not that long, a few years later, here he is filing for bankruptcy. One of the articles I read said that some of his assets include 5 cars. How does this happen? I mean, it's not, unfortunately, his is not a unique story, particularly among professional athletes, or really anyone who comes into a lot of money very quickly. We've heard this story many times with lottery winners, where they win millions of dollars, and in some relatively short period of time they're just flat broke. And it underscores something that I talked about particularly towards the beginning of this 31-day money challenge, and that is, it's not about how much you make, it's about how much you keep. You got to spend less than you make. And it's true whether you're making $45,000 as a teacher or $25.7 million as an NFL football player. Sometimes we get so focused on how much we make. That's not unimportant. But I think sometimes we're just fooling ourselves. I mean, we think, well, if we just made a little bit more, then we could save for retirement. If we made just a little bit more, then we could get out of debt. And I think we need to really examine those kinds of thoughts, because I think they could be leading us to decisions that aren't the best. And when I hear a story like this involving Vince Young, it's really sad. I don't know obviously the details. I don't know what happened to all of his money. Sometimes it can be advisors that perhaps gave him bad advice. But I mean, if that's the case, it underscores another important principle, and that is you got to take responsibility for your money. I don't care who you are or who you hire to help you. Ultimately, the responsibility is yours. No one will care about your finances more than you. Anyway, saw that in the news. I thought it was worth mentioning. $25.7 million guaranteed contract a few years ago, and now he's filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The second news item that caught my attention is that the U.S. stock market was down fairly significantly yesterday. And I saw on CNN, it was a title, it said, U.S. stocks take a drubbing on concern about corporate earnings. Dow slides 175 points, NASDAQ loses 0.6%. And first of all, I love how they always have to give a reason. The Dow is down because of concerns over corporate earnings. I don't know who has these concerns. I don't have these concerns. Maybe you do. I assume CNN found someone that they label an expert who gave it this reason. Sometimes the market is down just because it's down. There's a lot of things that go on. There was talk about China and its growth, and there were issues there. I don't know. Maybe that caused the stock market to go down. Who knows? But yesterday's drop in the market, I think, gives us a great opportunity, to talk about volatility in the stock market. When I see a drop like this, maybe it's partly just investing for so long. 1% drop in a day. You've seen it so many times after a while, it really doesn't have an effect on you. Or if it does, it's almost a positive one, because my initial reaction is now when I reinvest dividends, they'll be able to buy more shares. Or if I want to invest, as I invest monthly in my 401k, I'll be able to buy more shares because the prices are down. And a good analogy, I think, is, forest fires. They'll intentionally set controlled forest fires to help prevent serious forest fires. They call it a controlled burn, and they do it during cooler months of the year. And basically, it's to help reduce the potential fuel for a real serious forest fire. And I kind of look at yesterday's market as doing the same thing. When we see these drops in the market of 0.5%, 1%, 1.5% in a day, these kinds of things are helpful to avoid seeing a market run up that eventually results in a real forest fire where we see significant drops in the market. Of course, the reality is that significant drops in the market will happen. They're not going to be avoided. We see prices going up and eventually they come down, and you see that volatility and fluctuation. But these sort of what I think of are modest drops in a day or two or three actually are good things for the overall health of the market. Now, I think most would still say our market is overvalued. I think that's certainly true by most measures. It's not as overvalued as it has been in the past, but it's certainly above what you might consider the average market value if you measure it by price to earnings or price to book or yields or however. There's a number of ways to measure the value of the market. But I like the kind of days we had yesterday where you see that kind of decline. I think it's healthy for the market. Now, again, what the year is going to hold, who knows what this year will end up showing for the stock market or the bond market. There's no way to know. But that's how I sort of react to yesterday's market. I think it's generally healthy for the market, and it helps us as we're buying more shares, whether it's a mutual fund, an ETF, individual stocks. It's less expensive, and I think that's a good thing. Again, whether you're reinvesting dividends or you're simply investing on a monthly basis in your 401k. So those were the two news items from yesterday I wanted to mention and just talk about briefly. Now I've got just sort of a host of reader comments and and questions that I wanted to run through. The first comes from Kenneth. He actually had two. One was he asked me to put a link on my site to the podcasts, which I have done. If you go to DoughRoller.net, you'll see in the sort of navigation menu, I think the first one is resources, where I list a lot of the resources that I use and have used in the past. And then next to that is podcasts, and that just takes you to a page that lists all of the podcasts I've published, and I think it's in reverse chronological order. So very easy to get to if you want to do that. And I appreciate Kenneth's comment on that. It was something that I had planned to do and just hadn't gotten to it, and he gave me a good kick in the butt, and I got it done. The other thing he mentioned in a separate comment, and I'm actually going to go look it up now as I record this podcast, but it had to do with Betterment, actually, and my podcast on the investments that I invest in, the various Vanguard funds primarily, but also some Fidelity funds and individual stocks. And he had an interesting comment, and here it is. He said, "Rob, you sound like you have a very complicated but well-diversified portfolio. Maybe you have fun doing this. No reason to change. I've got all my non-401k money at Betterment, one of your 31-day challenge sponsors. Why? I just have to set one number, which I've dialed in at 75% stocks and 25% bonds. They take care of the rest, including automatic rebalancing and reinvesting." And he's absolutely right. Betterment is extremely easy, and I think that's one of its biggest selling points. You set the percent you want in stocks, the percent you want in bonds, and Betterment does the rest. So then the question is, well, if that's so great, Rob, why isn't all of your money in Betterment? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Of course, my 401k money can't be, as Kenneth mentioned, that he's only talking about his non-401k. That's one reason. A second reason is that I've been investing long before Betterment came into existence. I've been investing before the internet came into existence. And so I have a lot of investments in my taxable accounts that if I were to sell and move to Betterment, I'd get walloped with taxes. I mean, I have investments that I've held for a very, very long time. And so I would never sell them to move them to anywhere. It's not an issue of Betterment, it's an issue of taxes. So that's another reason. A third reason is I do invest in individual stocks, not something you can do through Betterment. And I do have Betterment account, and I do contribute to it monthly with automatic deposits. So Betterment is a part of my investment portfolio, but it's not, for those reasons, it's not, it doesn't hold all of my non-401k money. The other thing is with ease does come some loss of control. So, for example, you do set the percentage of stocks and bonds you want, and then Betterment does the rest. But if you want to overweight in some area, like you want more small cap exposure or more emerging market exposure than what Betterment offers, you've got to then go outside and get other funds. And that's effectively what I do. And in the past podcasts, I've explained why. So there's trade-offs there. But again, I think Betterment's selling point is its ease of use and relatively low fees. And obviously that's what has drawn Kenneth to Betterment as well. But I think his approach. That's one of the great. It's one of the things I stress. And I've had a number of people email me about this. I rarely find that there's one right answer or one reasonable answer to a personal finance question. There are plenty of wrong answers to just about every finance question. But I rarely believe there's just one right answer. So Kenneth's approach, I think, is terrific. And so that I think that's fabulous. And in fact, I'll compare Kenneth's approach to another reader, and I'm going to take this. I have all the comments and questions I want to talk about listed here in front of me, but I'm going to take this one out of order. This comment comes from a listener named Brian. He says, "I'm really enjoying listening to all your podcasts. Just finished DRO 28, How and Why to Keep Investing Costs Low." And that the DRO 28, I number all the podcasts. So O28 is simply my 28th podcast. So if you wanted to listen to it, just go to DoughRoller.net/podcast 28, and it would redirect you to it. Anyway, he says, "Keep up the great work. My overall ER, expense ratio, is 0.13%. So that's 13 basis points. That's fantastic. Brian's doing a terrific job. He says, "My asset allocation is 80-20, 80% stocks, 20% bonds." And then he goes through and he lists all of his investments. And I love reading this. Some of them are ones I've already mentioned, some of them are not, but 34% of his portfolio is in the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index, Admiral shares, 15% in a small cap, Vanguard. 18%, and it's in a Vanguard all-world fund. In other words, foreign fund, large cap. And then he's got 8% in a Vanguard all-world small cap fund. He's got 5% in REITs. And then for bonds, 10% in the Vanguard intermediate term tax exempt muni fund, which is one I mentioned. I invest in that fund as well. 5% in the Vanguard Total Bond Market Fund and 5% in I-bonds. And, that's fantastic. I think that's great too. It's obviously a different approach than what Kenneth is taking. It's probably closer to the approach that I'm taking, but not exactly the same. My investments are a little different. But he's got low cost index funds. He's got an expense ratio of 13 basis points. And, hopefully he's got a fairly aggressive asset allocation. It's what mine is set at as well, 80-20, which I'm very comfortable with. I assume he is too, or he wouldn't have that as his asset allocation. But he's doing great. And so, a couple of different approaches. But, when you think about these approaches, they have a lot in common. They seem very different. Well, Kenneth is using Betterment. Brian he's doing it on his own and using Vanguard and 80-20 allocation. There's a lot in common to their approaches. First of all, they're both low cost, critical. They're both low cost. Secondly, they're both well diversified. They're well diversified in different ways, but they're well diversified. They haven't put all of their eggs in one basket. And the third thing, and probably the most important, they're both investing. And that may seem trivial, but that's the hardest part, just getting started. It can be so overwhelming, a Vanguard account or a Betterment account. How do I get this started? Or I don't know what to invest in. That's one of the questions I've tried to answer in this 31-day money challenge, and I've given you other resources, books and other blogs and websites to look to. But that's the other thing that Kenneth and Brian both have in common. They're actually doing it. They're taking action. They've got their plan and they're executing. So, different approaches, yes, but they still share a lot in common, and a lot in common with my approach, which is, again, even a little different than both of theirs. So anyway, I thought those were good comments to share. Okay, reader question comes from Mark. I'm 23 years old and just recently graduated college. I've been working going on 6 months. I have $4,500 saved up since I graduated, which is amazing. The only debt I have is $25,000 school loan. My question is, do I need to concentrate on making extra payments on the school loan, or should I start putting money up for a down payment on a house? Thanks for any advice you have. Huge fan of the podcast. That's a great question, and I kind of addressed it, although not this specific one, in the episode of Which Way is Up, where I talked about dealing with competing financial goals. And of course, as I say that now, I completely forget which episode that was, but I'm going to look it up while I'm giving you my thoughts on Mark's question. But it's a perfect example of competing goals. Obviously he wants to get out of debt, as we all do. He wants to save up for a down payment on a house. So they're both great goals. So here's the first question: is do we pick one goal or the other? And if so, which one do we pick first? Another possibility would be to tackle them both. Maybe you could pay a little extra on the school loan while still saving up for a house. Here's really the question. If someone said, well, I want to get all my debt retired first before I buy a house, and it's my only debt, and I want to tackle it. So what are sort of the practical considerations? Well, one would be, well, how long is it going to take you to pay off that debt? If it's going to take you 10 years, you may not want to wait that long to buy a home. On the other hand, maybe you can have it paid off in a year or two. Man, that's, not too bad. The second question is, well, how big of a down payment is he going to save up? Of course, that depends on what he wants to buy. I always think at least a 20% down payment is ideal. I will tell you that's not what my wife and I did. We had a 5% down payment when we bought our first home in 1993. And I tell you that because, it's easy for someone to sit here on a podcast and say, you should save 20% for a down payment. Yeah, that is ideal. Not everyone does it. We didn't. And things worked out fine for us. You just have to recognize that the lower the down payment, the more risk involved. Because as you've seen, the real estate can go down. You can end up owing more than the house is worth, and that takes away options for you. So there's trade-offs, right? But for me, part of it would be how important it is to move. If I want to, if owning my own home is an important goal for me, and in my case, for my wife and I, we made that the priority. We bought our home while we still had school loans. And in fact, we had school loans for another 15 years after we bought our first home. And so that was our approach. But the thing is both of those goals are good ones financially, getting out of debt and buying a home. Those are both ways, obviously, to build wealth. You're paying down your loan, you're improving your balance sheet by reducing your liabilities. You buy a home, it's an asset. You're paying a mortgage, that goes into paying off the loan. And over the long term, the home will go up in value. I think generally roughly about the rate of inflation over the long term, but still it will go up in value. I don't know that I would really call it an investment because you're not generating income from it, but it is an asset that over the long term will go up in value. And of course, it gives you a place to live. So those are great goals. And you're saying, well, Rob, you really haven't answered this question. Well, I kind of have. The answer, in my opinion, is he could do either one. I would not believe that he needs to pay off all his school loans before he buys a home. Wasn't the approach we took. I don't see why that would have to be the case. Now, I should say this. It does depend on the interest rate. Since it's a school loan, I'm going to assume it's a relatively low interest rate. But if someone came to me and said, well, it's 23%, my view would be either refinance it to a lower rate or get that thing paid off as quickly as you can. But I'm going to assume that's not the case. And I think, that's his only debt. He's obviously very good at saving money. He saved $4,500 in 6 months. I think he could take either approach or a hybrid approach on this, and he would be fine. That's my view. The podcast, which way is up? Let me just grab that for you real quick before I go on to the next question. And I'm actually using the nice link at the top of my blog that Kenneth suggested that I do. And sure enough, I find it very quickly. It's DRO21. So just go to DoughRoller.net/podcast 21. Again, I titled that Which Way is Up? And the idea is, how do you, among competing goals, saving an emergency fund, getting out of debt, investing for retirement, or in Mark's case, saving for a down payment on a home, how do you prioritize those goals? Which one should you do first? Should you tackle multiple goals at the same time? And so that's what I addressed in that episode of the podcast. Okay, the next question comes from Stephen, and it's interesting. His first sentence says, if you read this on your podcast, please do not read my last name. You got it, Stephen. I won't read your last name. And for those listening and thinking about sending in a question, I never read your last name. And if you have a question that you don't want me to read on the podcast at all, just tell me, and I won't. That's simple. dr@DoughRoller.net, by the way, is where you can shoot me an email. Okay, so he goes on. Thanks for the podcast. I've listened to all of them, and they are very informative. I'm in the military, and my retirement pay will cover all my expenses with a little left over. That's fantastic. Even though all my and that was my addition. He didn't write that, but it is fantastic. Even though all my living expenses will be covered with my pension every year, he maxes out a Roth IRA and a Roth, effectively a Roth 401k. Toward the end of this year, I will open up a regular taxable account with Fidelity or maybe Vanguard and will contribute roughly about $2,000 per month. I am planning on only buying stock mutual funds, and then he has in parentheses the Mr. Money Mustache approach. Do you know of any good reason why I should buy anything else, i.e. diversify? If I keep up the current savings rate, I will make more in retirement than I do working, which that's fantastic. So really his question is it okay to invest 100% in stocks? Pete from Mr. Money Mustache does it, and I'm thinking of that approach. So I've, of course, already responded to Stephen's question. There's some interesting nuances in this question. He says, first of all, that I will make more in retirement than I do working. So that tells me he's really already got enough to retire on. Now, that doesn't mean you stop saving. I think there are still really good reasons to save, and even when you've got enough to retire on. But one question would be, does he need to take on the risk of stocks? Given where he stands right now. I remember Sue Zorman, who got into a heap of trouble when she said that she had all of her investments in bonds. And people just went crazy because that wasn't her advice to folks. And as I recall that story, which broke a couple of years ago, if I forgot the numbers correctly, she had $20 million in bonds. And I think her reasoning was, look, I've got a lot of money. I don't need to take on the risk of stocks, but most people aren't in my situation. I'm in a very unusual situation. I don't need to take on the risk of stocks. I can live a very comfortable life until I'm whatever 110 by keeping all of my money in low risk, i.e., no volatility or low volatility bonds. I don't need to take on the extra risk of stocks. And I can't argue with that approach. I mean, some would say that in some respects, bonds are actually riskier than stocks. They're not in volatility. They don't go up and down as much as stocks. But the risk is that the returns won't exceed the rate of inflation or won't exceed it by as much as stocks will. In other words, the capital you have invested won't grow in purchasing power. But she may say to that, yeah, I don't care about that either. I can take on that risk as well, and I'll be fine. And that may be Stephen's situation. But putting that aside now, the question is 100% stocks. Now, if you listen to Rick Ferri's interview, I interviewed Rick, and that was in podcast 3. He has written a lot of great books on investing. He manages $1.3 billion. That's billion with a B in funds. And he has his children's investments 100% in stocks. I think they're in their 20s. And his view is they've got a very long investing horizon, and they can handle the ups and downs of the market for now. And so why not invest all in stocks? Here's my take on this. First of all, if that's someone's choice in their 20s and they are confident that they will stick to that plan when the market loses 50%, and it will in their lifetime, or at least you should assume that it will, and it's lost that before. It's lost more than that before. After the market crash of 29, it lost about 80%. But 73, 74, it lost 40%. After inflation, 50%. If you can stomach that and stick to your plan and you've got a 30, 40, 50-year time horizon, I don't think it's a bad decision. I hope, though, you can tell the hesitation in my voice. And it's for a couple of reasons. One is it's very easy to read a book, listen to a podcast, read a blog, and I think the world of Mr. Money Mustache had him on the show, as you know, podcast 7, and then think, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. It's another thing to live through a 50% market decline or a market that goes a decade in stagnation and stick to your plan. It's kind of like the difference between handling an emergency in a flight simulator and handling one at 30,000 feet with 250 passengers in the back. It's very, very different. And so I suspect that 9 out of 10 people that are at 100% in stocks really won't be able to handle it for the long term. And by the way, something to think about, it's not just the market ups and downs. What happens when your assets are growing? Let's say you need $1 million to retire, just to pick a number, and you're at 700,000, and you can just see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's not that far. And then bam, the market crashes and your 700 is now worth 450. You're going to stick to 100% stocks? There's just some practical realities that I think keep people from that kind of asset allocation, and it's very difficult to know how you're really going to behave just from reading a book or just, from a blog or a website. Now, if you've been investing for 10 years, 20 years, you've been through a number of downturns, and you just bought more and you didn't sell a thing, then you know how you're going to react. But I think a lot of people that are 100% stocks don't. I would suggest this. If you're seriously considering a 100% stock portfolio, read 4 Pillars of Investing. It's an excellent book. I've read it before, but I'm actually rereading it now. And one of the things that I like about it is it gives some historical perspective to the stock market. And it's by William Bernstein, again, The 4 Pillars of Investing. And I think it's a good book for every investor. But if you're thinking about 100% stock portfolio, I would suggest his book. The other thing I would say is, and I know I'm spending some time on this question. I think it's an important one. One answer to that, when people tell me I'm going to invest 100% in stocks, one of the questions I ask them is, what are you going to invest in? And the answer is usually some kind of Vanguard, either the S&P 500 or the total market and index fund. And I'll say to them, well, why are you going to do that? He goes, well, what do you mean? You're doing that because over the long term stocks beat bonds, right? Right. Okay, well, I can take that one step further. Why not invest in the Vanguard Small Cap Value Fund? Over the long term, it'll do better than the S&P 500 or the total stock market index fund. So, if your theory is you've got 40 or 50 years, why not go with the best? Why not go with the small cap value? I've never had anyone actually take me up on that. It's like, that's just a little too uncomfortable. Well, why? Why can you stick with your plan with a total stock market index fund, but you won't be able to stick with your plan with a small cap value fund, or for that matter, emerging markets? Yeah, that's even more of a wild ride. But over the long, you got 50 years to invest. I mean, won't you end up doing better in the long term? And I think this is where we see sort of the tension between theory and reality, right? And so, look, if you're young and you've got a long time to invest and you've just given a lot of good thought and you're going to be 100% stocks, great. That's what you're going to do. Just be prepared for a wild, wild ride. So that's my take on it. I wouldn't say it's wrong. I would just say it's really, really risky, and you should be prepared for a wild ride. Now, I'm at 80-20 allocation. Frankly, that's not a huge difference. It's a difference. It's a difference. But in that kind of portfolio, I could lose 40% in 1 year. And I realize that. And it's one of the reasons that, as I've mentioned in past podcasts, I'm going to start to let my bond portfolio drift upward. Because as I get older, I don't want to take on that risk, that volatility. Now, I'm not going to go to 50-50 or something like that, but I'm going to let it move up to probably 25% bonds, maybe a little bit more. And of course, over time, it will definitely go more. But I mean, in the foreseeable future, that's my plan. I have another plan too related to this, and I'll come back to it when I get to the question. But that's my sort of long-winded answer to Stephen's question. And happy to hear your thoughts. So feel free to email me. But that's kind of how I think through this issue. All right, let's see what we've got next. All right, this question comes from David. I recently stumbled upon your blog and have enjoyed the content as well as the podcast in particular. I appreciate your gracious demeanor, which indicates wisdom beyond financial matters. Man, I like that. I should put that on my blog somewhere. Thanks for putting your work out there for the benefit of others. I wanted to see if you could provide me with some advice. My wife and I currently have surplus income over expenses of $2,400 a month. That's fantastic. Again, that's my commentary, not his email. But that's really, really good. We're about 4 to 5 months away from paying off our mortgage. Wow, this guy is unbelievable. We have no other debt. He goes on to say, though, that they will be buying another home in 3 to 5 years. He explains why, and I'm not going to go into that. But here's this real question. We'd like to buy the next home with cash. Are there any investment vehicles you could recommend for generating a return on our house savings as they accumulate? And he talks about having a high-interest savings account, but he's really thinking about the Vanguard S&P 500 index fund because, for those of you that have online banks, and I track these on my site, and I'll even leave a link in the show notes, but 75 to 85 basis points is about the best you can do. So he's thinking about an S&P 500. However, because of the relatively short duration, would it be unwise to take on the risk of principal loss for a better return? So one way I could answer this question is, yes, it's unreasonable. You could lose a lot of money in 3 to 5 years. Don't do it. I really think that kind of answer, which you get a lot from financial experts, is really unhelpful. And that's not how I answered David's question. My approach to this is say, okay, well, let's look at the pros and cons of each. So if you stick to a high interest savings account, the advantage is FDIC insured, you're not going to lose any money. That's obvious. The downside, you're only going to make 85 basis points. Yeah, it could go up, and you got 3 to 5 years, so the interest rates could go up on savings accounts. If I were a betting man, I'd argue that they will, but who knows when and who knows by how much. Right now, you're getting a lousy return. So that's the advantages and disadvantages of a bank account. For the S&P 500, obviously, the potential advantage is you can make a lot more than that over 3 to 5 years. And we all know the disadvantage. You could not only lose money, but you could lose so much that you'd have to put off the purchase of your next home. And therein really lies the question. How important is that 3 to 5 year time frame? If by golly, you've got to be in a house within 3 to 5 years, you cannot delay it another moment, then by investing in the S&P 500 index fund, you are taking a significant risk that you'll have less money than you started with. The market can easily be down over a 3 to 5 year period, which would cause you to either delay buying the home or buying a less expensive home. That's the risk. Now, if you have some flexibility, if the market went down and you could put off buying the next home for a couple of years, that maybe weighs a little more in favor of the Vanguard or a stock option, a stock approach. But you've still got the risk. Even if you could put your home purchase off, say, until year 7, for example, you still risk having an account that's got a lower balance. Now, the other thing I mentioned to David, though, is you could take a hybrid approach, right? You could keep some in savings. You could have some in a stock fund. You could have some in a bond fund to give, I would probably stick to short-term bonds because of the interest rate risk, right? Interest rates rise and your bond fund goes down in value. You could take that approach. And so what would that mean? Well, you'd have a greater chance of earning more than just a savings account. You'd have a chance of losing some money, but it wouldn't be as risky as all Vanguard S&P 500. So there you go. Now, then the question is, okay, Rob, that's terrific. Those are the options, I guess. What would you do? Well, it depends on how important the home buying was for me. If it was critical that I moved into a home in the next 3 to 5 years, and I knew I could achieve that goal by investing or keeping my money in a savings account, that's what I'd do. If I had more flexibility, maybe had more access to other funds potentially, then I might take a little more risk with it. So that was my answer to David's question. Feel free to sound off if you'd like and shoot me an email with your thoughts on that. I think it's a great question. I mean, it's sort of a practical, real world question. And it's one of those that doesn't have an easy answer, but there are reasonable options. And the good news for David is he's obviously in a great position financially. And it's just a question, I think, of deciding what's most important to him. Okay. Next question, and this is the last question. Reader question comes from Joe. Hi, Rob. For asset allocation purposes, I'm looking to rebalance and add more bond funds. I'm sure others are in the same boat after the stock market run-up. However, I am concerned about the impact of rising interest rates on bonds in the future. Is it better to sit on the sidelines for now or take the plunge with a total bond fund or stick to short-term or corporate or inflation protection bond funds in this environment? Also, how about international bonds? Well, again, my view is to come up with an asset allocation plan and stick to it. Yes, bonds are very expensive right now, which is just another way of saying their yields or their interest rates are very low. And as I've said repeatedly, as interest rates rise, the value of bond funds goes down. And so, the conventional wisdom is bonds have nowhere to go, interest rates have nowhere to go but up, and when they do, bond funds will get hurt. I tend to just stick to my plan, which is intermediate bond fund. Now, I think it's fine to focus more on shorter-term bond funds rather than longer-term bond funds, but I wouldn't change my overall stock-to-bond allocation. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean that long-term bonds won't do great this year. They could. Interest rates could still not go up. Maybe who knows? They could even go down a little bit. It seems crazy, but I mean, 3 years ago, I thought interest rates were going to go up then. Shows you how good I am at predicting all this stuff. So that's my view. I tend to keep my bond portfolio very, very simple, as I described in the past episodes. I think it's perfectly fine to have international bonds, and it's perfectly fine to have a portion of inflation protection bonds, which would be either TIPS or I bonds. I've had both at various times. I have I bonds, a small amount in I bonds now. I tend to just stick to the intermediate term Vanguard fund, and then I have the tax exempt muni fund in my taxable account. But I generally shy away from making investing decisions based on what I think the market will do, simply because I've just been wrong so many times. But that Joe's question kind of leads me into a question of my own that I want to talk about, and that is what do you do with cash? I mean, if you've got money to invest. As David's question a question ago mentioned, interest rates are so low on savings accounts. Bond funds seem really expensive right now because interest rates are so low. And the stock market, again, this isn't a prediction of what's to come, but it is expensive. It's not as expensive as I've seen it, but, stock prices are high by any measure. And so it's almost like where do we have to turn? I mean, it's like all of the doors are closed. What do we do? And this is something that I've been thinking about with the extra cash that we have each month. And one of the things that I think where I've kind of come out on this is, first of all, I don't change my asset allocation plan. As I guess you probably know by now, I've said that 1,000 times. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I take more cash and move it into my investments. And so one of the options for us is to pay off our mortgage early. We have a 4%, 3 7/8, but let's call it 4% mortgage. Of course, there's tax deduction, so that lowers the effective interest rate. But it's as risk-free an investment as you can find. It wallops a savings account right now. It generally beats what bonds are paying. Will it beat the stock market long term? No, of course not. But of course, it's risk-free, and the stock market ain't. And the stock market right now is kind of expensive. Again, I'm not making a decision because I think the stock market will go down this year. But it is an assessment that the stock market is kind of expensive. Do I want to take extra cash and put it there right now? Why not pay on our mortgage? Now, I tend to take hybrid approaches to a lot of things, so I will not put 100% of our cash towards our mortgage. But I paid extra on it last year, and it's something that I'm going to continue to do this year. And I think it's a solid investment. I certainly don't think it's a bad decision. Now, could savings account rates go up to 5% within 2 years, and I wish I'd have just put it all in savings, and now I'm actually earning more on an FDIC insured savings account than I am, paying on my mortgage. Sure, it's possible. Yeah, that's possible. I have no idea, but I seriously doubt I'm going to be upset and losing sleep because I don't have a mortgage 2 or 3 years from now, which is kind of my goal. And so that's how I'm thinking about cash right now. The other thing I'm thinking, if you've been listening to all the podcasts, one reader asked about a Betterment article that said you should have your emergency fund in sort of a stock bond mix, and they suggested what they would do for if it were in Betterment. And I mentioned that I kind of like to have some of my emergency fund in cash, and I mentioned 3 months. But as I started to think about that, I thought, to some extent, Betterment is right in this sense. Holding cash is expensive because it's 85 basis points. It's less than in the inflation rate. So I want to hold as much cash as I think I need, but not $1 more. I want to put the rest to work, whether it's paying off the mortgage early or putting it in my investments. And so I'm really starting to rethink my 3-month cash cushion. I mean, I have other resources and taxable investments that I could tap if I had to. Do I really need 3 months of cash? Can I get away with 1 month of cash? So that's something that I'm kind of working through right now. Here's the thing. There's no one right answer to that question. The other thing is no matter how long you've been doing this, there's always the chance that you're going to think about things differently a year from now or 5 years from now or 10 years from now. I know I have. My views on personal finance and investing have changed dramatically over the last 20 years. And who knows, 5-10 years from now, they could change. I'm sure they'll be different than they are today. But this is one thing where this 31-day money challenge has been great for me because you guys have been asking some fantastic questions and really challenging me in a way. It's like you really have to think, well, why do I believe what I believe? Why do I need 3 months in cash? Do I really need that? Maybe I need more. I don't think so, but these are good questions to ask. Okay, that gets me to why early retirement is a terrible goal and how you can tell if you're on track to retire. So why do I say early retirement is a terrible goal? I've gotten a lot of questions about Mr. Money Mustache, podcast 7. He's the guy that retired at 30, he lives on about $25,000 a year with his family in Colorado. And so let me ask you something. If someone tells you they retired at 30, that tells you a lot about that person. One, that they're good at making goals and following through. They're obviously good at saving money, presumably investing the money. It also tells you they didn't love what they were doing before they retired, right? I mean, if they loved it, they wouldn't have stopped. Now, that doesn't mean they hated what they were doing. My sense of Pete from Mr. Money Mustache is he probably didn't hate what he was doing. He, in fact, in many ways found it challenging, but he didn't love it enough to continue doing it when he no longer needed to, right? Well, let's compare that to probably the poster child of potential early retirees, Warren Buffett. Here's a guy in his 80s. He's still working. I'm pretty confident he could retire if he wants to on his $50+ billion in assets. One of the things he said is that the thing that money did for him at an early age was it allowed him to do what he loves to do, and he's never stopped. He's doing what he loves to do. It just so happens to be something that makes a lot of money. His salary actually is quite modest, at least by his standards, $100,000 as I recall. Of course, his wealth is not in his salary, right? It's in shares of Berkshire Hathaway. But here's a guy that could have retired decades ago, and he loves what he does. So why do I say early retirement is a terrible goal? To me, the goal isn't to retire early. The goal is not to have $1 million in the bank. The goal is not to retire by age 65, right? Here's the question. If you retire early at whatever age, what are you going to do? That's your goal. I mean, maybe it's going to be to work for a charitable organization. Maybe it's going to be to travel the world. Maybe it's going to be like Warren Buffett and to invest in companies, or like Brandon Turner, who we interviewed yesterday, to invest in real estate. Maybe that's what he loves to do. I've got my best friend's father, who could have retired a long time ago, still invests in real estate because he loves it. And isn't that really the goal of personal finance? Isn't that really the goal of financial freedom? To give you the options to do what it is you love to do in life. That, to me, should be the goal. Anyway, just a thought, and that gets me now to how you can tell if you're on track to retire. And I warned you at the beginning, this was going to be a long podcast. I hope you've stuck with me. So this is going to be how to tell if you're on track for what I'll call a traditional retirement. Not the Mr. Money Mustache retirement, but the retired age 65 retirement. And it comes from a book that I think is a very, very good book. I've read it several times, and it's called Money Ratios. And actually, let me give you the full title. It's called Your Money Ratios, 8 Simple Tools for Financial Security at Every Stage of Life by Charles Farrell. He's a money manager. He's actually a lawyer too, poor guy. But he's a money manager, and I think it's an excellent book. And so here's what he does. He says, okay, for most people, you should be able to live on 80% of your pre-retirement income when you retire. So just, if you're at 65, you're making $100,000 a year, just to make the math easy, you should be able to live on $80,000 a year. And his reason for that is pretty simple. He says, well, you're no longer going to be saving for retirement. You can back that out. That's a big chunk if you're saving 12, 15%. You're not going to have the payroll taxes, and you're not going to have certain other expenses in terms of getting to work and all that sort of thing. And so you should be able to live on 80% of your pre-retirement income. Now, let me just stop right there with that. That's an assumption he makes, right? That may not be right for you. Look at Mr. Money Mustache. He lived on far less than that. Some people may need to live on a lot more than that. So that's the one thing I want to say as I kind of walk through this idea of the money ratio as Charles Farrell sets it out. This is a rough rule of thumb. I think it is a good way to think about retirement as a starting point. But you may be able to save 50% of your income, and if you can, you only need to live on 50%, right? It's simple math. But I think for a lot of people, 80% of their pre-retirement income is a rough, good starting point. And so that's what he uses. Again, this is a general book. It's not tailored to you or to me. He obviously can't do that. So this is a sort of a rough guide. So that's his first point. He says, now, if you want to live on 80% of your pre-retirement income, how much do you have to have? Well, his answer is 12 times your gross annual income. So if you have $100,000 income, you want to live on $80,000 a year. When you retire, you need $1.2 million. Now, in his book, he goes into great detail as to how he comes up with that calculation. I want to kind of just focus on part of that, and it's this. He assumes that in retirement, you will withdraw 5% of your nest egg each year, adjusted for inflation. Now, I've talked a lot about this on the site. I've seen a more conservative withdrawal rate of 4%. And this is not an unimportant issue. We could debate 4% versus 5%. Some say 3, some say 6. I always use 4%, but in Charles Farrell's case, he uses 5%. If you were going to use 4%, you'd need more than 12x your gross annual income. But we'll stick with his 5% withdrawal assumption. One of the things, though, that he says that I think is really important is this. You may not actually withdraw the 5% every year because of how the market performs. Some year you may need to withdraw less. If the market's really down, you want to take as little out as you can. On the other hand, if the market's up, you may take out more. So he says reality probably falls in the 4 to 6% range. And this is his point. To have that kind of flexibility, to be able to say, well, this year I'll take out 4% or 3.5%. Next year, if the market's up, I'll take 6%. You need to have all your debts paid off. You need to be debt-free when you retire. So what he does in his book is he says, okay, those are the goals. We want to be debt-free. We want to have 12 times our gross annual income at age 65. Now, how do we make sense of that? You may be 30. Like you're saying, well, I'm 30. Okay, that's great when I'm 65, but how does that help me now? How do I figure that out? So he has a number of ratios. And I'm going to talk about a couple of them. The first is the capital to income ratio. In other words, it's simple. How much should you have saved by the time you're 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60? How much should you have in the bank at each of those points to be on track to save 12 times your gross annual income by the time you're 65? And he has a chart. So at 25, you should have 0.1%. So if you're making $100,000, you should have $10,000 in the bank at age 25. And then at 30, you should have 0.6, or in our example, $60,000 in the bank. At 35, you should have 1.4, which would, again, in our example, $140,000. And he has these ratios. 40, it's 2.4 times your income. At 45, 3.7 times your income. At 50, 5.2% of your income. 55, 7.1%. At 60, 9.4%. At 65, you'll have your 12 times your income. Now, I read through those numbers quickly. I'll leave them in the show notes. I think that is a good way to get a very rough idea if you are on track. Now, again, you may make a lot more money than you think you'll need in retirement, or you may make a lot less, or you may have just changed careers or jobs and gotten a fantastic raise, but you just got it, and your savings hasn't had time to catch up to the increased income. I mean, there's 100 different ways why your situation could be unique, right? And you just need to keep that in mind. But I think this gives you a kind of a rough idea if you're on track, if you've saved enough. Now, it could also be eye-opening. It could be discouraging, but I don't think we should hide from the truth. The truth may be that you need to save more. Everyone's situation is different. I'm just conveying the information. What you do with it is up to you. Now, you say, okay, Rob, that's great. I get the capital to income ratio, and I'm 40, and that my capital to income ratio is 2.4, and maybe I'm there, maybe I'm not. But how much should I be saving? What percent should I be saving to hit these numbers? Well, he has a savings ratio. For him, those 25 to 40 should save 12% of their income, their gross income, and those 45 to 65 should save 15%. You say, well, why does it go up? Well, part of the thought is when you're young, you have a family, you're buying a home, you have these sort of other expenses. But when you get to the midlife, you're 45, you're old like me, then, the kids move out of the house, hopefully. Maybe some expenses have gone down. You can save 15%. That's the theory behind why it goes from 12% to 15% once you reach 45. And if you save that and invest it, his investment asset allocation, by the way, is roughly 50-50. I personally think that's too conservative, but that was what he used. Then you should hit these marks. And again, this is just a rough starting guide. But I think the beauty in all of this is the simplicity. That's also the negative side of this, is it's not custom tailored to you, and you may need that and want that. And if you do, I would highly recommend either more research on your own or to contact a certified financial planner. But I think these are pretty good and easy numbers to apply to get a rough sense as to where you stand. He also, by the way, has a debt ratio. And as it relates to mortgages, you know what he thinks the most you should take out on a mortgage is? 2 times your income. And then, of course, you should pay that down over the years so you're debt-free when you retire. That's pretty conservative. I'm trying to think. When we bought our first house, it was close to 3 times my income. My wife was home. My wife was in grad school, so she wasn't working. And our first home was probably about 2.8 times my annual income. So I would have flunked the Charles Farrell debt ratio test. But there it is. That is a fairly easy way to determine if you are on track to retire, at least given all of those assumptions. It's always important to understand the assumptions. And of course, your situation could be very different for a number of reasons, but I give you this as a starting point, and I will link to his book and his website. And that brings us to music time. There we go. As always, you can get the show notes to this podcast. Just go to DoughRoller.net/podcast 31. Podcast 31, hard to believe. If you haven't already, you can subscribe to this podcast. Just go to DoughRoller.net/iTunes. You can subscribe and leave a review. If you want to reach out to me, dr@DoughRoller.net. Love to hear from you. Read and respond to every email. If you haven't already, sign up for our newsletter. at DoughRoller.net/newsletter. It goes out every week on Saturday, packed full of resources and tips to help you make the most of your money. You can also leave me a voicemail, believe it or not. Just go to speakpipe.com/DoughRoller. Love to hear from you. So until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.